Hi everybody and welcome to the kickoff session of the first Inclusive Leadership Global Conference. My name is Compoint. I'm a host and founder of this pioneering online event. And throughout this week, you will be getting access to the recorded interviews of world-class speakers from all over the world, talking about the leadership behaviors to drive inclusion and performance. I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing each single expert for this conference. And it's been an amazing experience because I've had lots of insights, not only by interviewing brilliant experts, also by interviewing really inspirational human beings. And I'm sure you will enjoy a lot what's coming next. And let me explain to you how this virtual conference works. So basically for 7 days, from today, July the 3rd until July the 9th, you will have access to the recorded interviews of world-class speakers. Each day, there will be 3 to 4 interviews broadcast, and the interviews are broadcast for 24 hours. Starting at 0 time, British summertime. And if by any chance you wish to have permanent access to any of the interview recordings, or if you think you're going to miss any of the sessions during the conference, you can get yourself a copy of the conference box set with all the interview recordings to listen to whenever you want. And the conference box set is for half price until July 15. And you can get it using a link that you will see just below my video. And this session is my session. It's a funny session because I'm actually interviewing myself. And the topic of the session is the 3 signature skills of inclusive leaders. And before I get started, I think it would be good to share a few words with you about myself. So I'm an award-winning author, speaker, trainer, and consultant who's been specializing in inclusion and diversity for the past 18 years. I am the author of the book Succeed as an Inclusive Leader, that is right here by my side. This is a book that I wrote this year. It's available on Amazon, and it's really the book that I wanted to read. And I must say, I love my book. I'm my biggest fan and reader. I'm always coming back to my book. Really proud of it. I'm also a TED speaker. I am a regular Huffington Post contributor, and most importantly, I am the CEO of The Click International, which is a global consultancy that I founded last year after having led the inclusion and diversity strategies of 3 Fortune 500 companies. So I worked for Vinci in the construction industry. I've led the European inclusion and diversity strategy of Coca-Cola Enterprises. And I've led the inclusion strategy for the worldwide sales teams at Cisco, the IT giant. And I've received quite a few awards, 13 awards altogether for the work that I've done in my life. And there are 2 awards that make me particularly proud. There is one award that is called the Diversity Leader Award that I received in the United States. And this is a recognition of myself as being one of the diversity specialists who are advancing diversity in the corporate world. And the other award that makes me particularly proud is the European Diversity Award that I received when I was leading Coca-Cola Enterprises European strategy. And I received that award as the leader of the best diversity team in Europe. I see inclusive leadership as the ability to lead successfully diverse teams. And to me, inclusive leaders, they really know how to attract, how to inspire, and how to engage people with different backgrounds, people of all genders and ages, with different cultures, different abilities, different lifestyles. And the reason why inclusive leaders are very good at that is because they value human differences, and they know how to manage human differences effectively, so that they create an environment where people really feel trusted, they feel they belong, and they can bring their best version of themselves. I love the comparison between inclusive leadership and cooking. I really think it's very pertinent, and to me, really, if you see diversity as the ingredients in a team, and inclusion as the recipe that you use to combine, those ingredients in the best way, the inclusive leader is really the chef, the cook, who knows how to choose the right ingredients, and know how to use the right recipe to cook the perfect meal. The first reason is the fact that inclusive leadership helps business leaders navigate the major demographic and cultural trends that are affecting the world today. And I can think of at least 3 major trends. Women have an increasingly important role in the economy and in society. Also, societies are more and more multicultural, and companies are more and more multi-generational. And so inclusive leaders, they are more connected with this, real world, and they have a more 360-degree vision of the world, and this allows them to better navigate and even adapt and anticipate, the evolving needs of customers on the one side and of workers on the other side. So that's one reason. The other reason is the fact that there are lots of studies that show that diverse teams led inclusively, they can take better decisions, they can solve more problems, they are more engaged, more productive, more innovative, and even financially speaking, there are lots of studies that show that inclusion and diversity brings a return on investment, financially speaking. So that's another important reason. And a third reason for me is really the fact that if you are a values-driven person, and business leaders can also be, value-driven people, if it's important for you to make a positive impact in the lives of people around you, I think that's definitely something you should be interested in, because inclusive leadership is also the right thing to do. So I think it's this combination of these 3 things that make inclusive leadership such an appealing concept. It's the beauty to me and the power of this topic. You're really conciliating profit and purpose, and I think that's great. And maybe in a nutshell, I would say that inclusive leaders, they reach their goals more easily, while building a better world, and I think that's the perfect combination. So the first reason is affinity bias, and the second reason is lack of empathy. I'll explain myself. So affinity bias is our tendency as human beings to stay together with people who are just like ourselves, because actually our brain has an evolutionary requirement to do so, isn't it? We are constantly screening the environment unconsciously, looking for danger signs, and unfortunately our unconscious minds sometimes see people who are different from ourselves as threats. So that's one of the reasons why we love, most of us, like to stay together with people who are just like ourselves, who think like ourselves, who behave like ourselves. We don't like to get out of our comfort zones naturally. And I have a very funny example of a director that I was interviewing once, and he was complaining to me about his difficulties in finding qualified engineers. And as I started to talk with him about what were the key requirements he was looking for, how was what was his talent pool, and we were talking about, I realized, he told me that to him one of the first things that he looked on a CV, on a resume, was whether or not the candidate had been a scout, because he had been a scout himself, and he found that people who had been scouts were very trustworthy, and he wanted to have, former scouts in his teams. And the same person was complaining how hard it was to hire qualified candidates. And it's no wonder, because his talent pool was tiny, tiny, tiny engineers who had a history as scouts, when they were kids. So that's a tragic, and funny example at the same time about affinity bias. Now, lack of empathy is also the other reason why inclusive leadership doesn't come naturally. And when I say empathy, I'm thinking about emotional empathy, our ability to feel other people's pain. But most importantly, I'm really referring to cognitive empathy. It's this ability to see their world through other people's eyes. What are people's needs? What do they want? What makes them tick? It doesn't come naturally to most of us. Most of the times we are projecting on other people our vision of the world, and we think that others want things just the way we want things, to be done, which is not always the case. And I also have a few examples, when I think about this. I remember having talked to a person who was working in a department. It was a sales department. He was a young father. So work-life integration was really important to him. And he happened to have a manager who had a stay-at-home wife. He had grown-up kids. And that manager didn't realize how inconvenient, the timings for his meetings were for his team members. And in particularly, this person who was telling me this story, who had kids at a very young age. So most of the meetings, the team meetings, were done at a very early hour in the morning. And there was even a time when this manager decided to do the kickoff meeting of the year the same day school was starting, in that country. It was Belgium, actually, the country. And that was obviously not a very good idea for, people, parents of young kids. And that person, that manager, had obviously, not being confronted with the needs of young parents. He didn't understand how inconvenient he was making, the working organization for some of his team members. But some examples are very concrete, like I remember once I was in a factory where female workers were very rare, and they were leaving the organization at a much, much faster pace than the male workers. And as I was talking to people, running my focus groups in that organization, I realized that actually there were no toilets in the main area where workers stayed. There were no specific ladies' toilets. So female workers, they had to walk a long way to go to the toilets in the reception, because nobody had thought that they would need, female and male toilets in that area of the factory. And when I told this story to the site director, he was so surprised and really sad with himself, because he had been at that factory for 10 years and he had never noticed that there were no women's toilets in the major factory area. That's another example of how sometimes it's difficult to put yourself in other people's shoes, isn't it? And provide the best work environment to everyone. The 3 key signature skills of inclusive leaders are fairness, empathy, and proactivity. And actually, I created a model that I called the Inclusive Leadership Propeller Model. That is a very simple tool and framework that you can apply to every single managerial situation to check on your blind spots. And I love this. The reason why I named it Propeller Model is because I like to this image of, the organization or the team being the boat and the inclusive leader being the propeller. And for a propeller to work properly, you need to at least 3 blades. So similarly, an inclusive leader, to be really inclusive, he or she has to be simultaneously fair, empathetic, and proactive. And if he does or she does those 3 things consistently, he or she will take his or her boat, very far. The boat being your team or your organization. And so we can start with fairness. So fairness doesn't come naturally. We know out of all the research on unconscious bias, we know that fairness doesn't come naturally. And to me, fairness is really giving everybody the same chances. And the way you can do that is by being aware of your unconscious bias and in how it impacts your decision making, your behaviors, and using techniques to mitigate the impact of such unconscious bias in yourself. I'm a big fan of Star Wars, and the one thing that I find really moving, in the film is the fact that, when you have the heroes that are fighting their inner dark side. I like that because unconscious bias and being fair is about, acknowledging your internal dark side, the little Darth Vader that is inside yourself. So that's the first step. I guess there is a lot of research that shows that the more objective you think you are, actually the more biased you are. So being aware of your own bias is the very first step in order to mitigate the impact of bias in your decision making. So acknowledge your little Darth Vader inside yourself and use techniques to mitigate its influence in your decisions. And how can you do this? There are lots of things you can do, but I wanted to share with you here maybe 4 things that you can do. I think the one thing that can be very powerful for inclusive leaders, to practice their fairness muscles is to ask yourselves the right questions. So whenever you are taking decisions about people, ask yourself, where is the bias in this situation? Because all situations are biased somehow. Where is the bias in this situation? Whenever you are hiring people or trying to promote people, ask yourself, replace the question, does he or she fit into the organization? With the question, what does this person add to the team? And that's very important because the fit question is a very insidious way by which affinity bias, can influence the makeup of organizations. So ask yourself good questions, and there are lots of other questions you can ask. The other thing you can do is to take the Harvard implicit association tests that are free to be done. They are online, so it's very easy. You can just go there and put on your keyboard Harvard implicit association tests, and you can actually measure your unconscious bias in several areas. So I think that's another very powerful way you can become aware of your own unconscious bias. The other thing you can do really to become a fairer leader is to genuinely follow structured processes. So we know that, for instance, when you are running interviews to hire people, it's good to look at CVs simultaneously rather than one after the other. That would be one of the techniques, for instance. Also, when you are running meetings, make sure that you are giving everybody the chance to speak at some point, because, in meetings, some people can be more vocal than others. So following smart processes, it's also a good way to mitigate the impact of unconscious bias. And another also very smart way to mitigate the impact of unconscious bias is looking at your metrics, because metrics can reveal unconscious bias that we are not able to see in everyday life. And I remember having been in an organization where there was a perception by employees that as a little bit of ageism was going on in that organization. And, most of management team members, they were completely unaware of that ageism tendency. And when we looked at the numbers, it became very clearly that there was an ageism tendency, because that organization, although they were hiring lots of people in the past 3 years in promoting as well, there was no one with more than 50 years old that had been hired or promoted in that organization. So looking at your numbers also can show you where your blind spots are and help you to take actions. The second signature skill of inclusive leaders is empathy. And again, I'm talking about cognitive empathy, which is your ability to put yourself in other people's shoes. And I think the most effective way you can become more empathetic is by applying the platinum rule. And the platinum rule says that instead of treating other people as you'd like to be treated, you should treat other people as they'd like to be treated. And I think there are two key ways by which you can find out, how people would like to be treated. And to me, those are really key habits in inclusive leaders. So the first thing is to be curious about people. And the second thing is to be really aware of your impact on other people. Let's talk a little bit about being curious, because I think curiosity is a very important human trait in inclusive leaders. You really have to want to find out, what's going on in people's lives, what are their preferences, what is important to them. And the way you can do this is by observing people, is by listening to what people have to say. It's also by asking questions, obviously without being intrusive, but it's simply by asking questions. And I find that inclusive leaders, they have this ability to have conversations from human to human. And I think it's a very important characteristic of inclusive leaders. Definitely on the naturally inclusive leaders that I crossed, throughout my career, that I had the privilege to encounter. And by the way, I can share with you a very personal story regarding an inclusive and empathetic leader. There was a time in my career when I was coming back from my third maternity leave, and I was about to embark in a major mission involving lots of traveling. And then I met for the second time the CEO of the organization for which I was going to start, this mission. And this was a very powerful man. He was, leading an organization that had over 40,000 employees. And I was a consultant for that person, for that organization. And that man, he had seen me only once before. And then when he saw me for the second time, before the mission started, he looked at me and he said, "Thais, how are you? And how is your baby? And how are you feeling? How is it, to restart working again?" And then he said, I hope you have the right support at home. And in less than 2 minutes, I became his biggest fan. You know why? Because that person showed to me that he knew who I was. He knew what my situation was. He showed me that he cared about me, and he was asking me questions that even my manager at the time had failed to ask. And those were the really important questions to me. So in a very tiny little conversation of 3 minutes, he made my engagement towards that mission go 1,000 times higher than what it had been. So that's a little example of how, just simply by asking questions about people and showing that you care and that you're curious about them, you can really find out what's important for people. And the other thing is really to understand your impact on people, especially the impact of your leadership style on your team members. And I remember another story where there was this manager, he had a virtual team, really people in different continents, and he was a very absent manager who didn't give a lot of feedback to his team members, and some of his team members needed lots of feedback and they couldn't understand why they weren't getting it. And then I talked with the manager and he told me that he didn't like to have too much feedback, and his assumption was that, when he didn't hear from his own boss, everything was fine. To him, no news, good news. So he was projecting this preference of his onto his team members, and it wasn't really working at all, actually. So a very important thing that you should do as an inclusive leader is simply to ask for feedback on your inclusive leadership style, and how, what else do people need from you in order to, perform, the best as they can. Proactivity. And to me, proactivity is really this ability to accelerate change without positively discriminating. So positive discrimination or reverse discrimination happens when you decide that you want to hire someone or promote someone only because he or she belongs to a minority group, and you simply forget all about skills and competence. And I think this is very bad, and this is completely counterproductive for everybody involved, in the process. However, there are many ways, there are many initiatives that you can take that will increase your chances of building a more diverse team, of hiring, of developing and retaining more diverse employees, in things that don't compromise your standards. And I can think of a few examples. For instance, if you decide that when you're hiring, you also ask for a diverse list of candidates, that's a very good thing, a good way to force yourself to look at talent pools that you wouldn't look normally. Decisions will always be taken based on skills and competences, but you will make a bigger effort to reach out to more diverse candidates that you wouldn't normally look for. So that's a good way to be proactive in the inclusion and diversity space. Another way is to raise awareness about inclusion and diversity. And I can think of a very concrete example of a finance director that I knew in one of my previous organizations. And every year when he was organizing his annual leadership team meeting, he would include inclusion and diversity as part of the agenda. So he was constantly raising his team's awareness and building the skills of his leadership team members when it comes to inclusion and diversity. You can mentor people. You can make sure that the people that you are mentoring right now are people who are different from yourself, and they represent a fairly diverse group of people. You can also, for instance, pair people in your teams, people from different cultures or from different generations, so that people can learn from each other. So there are many different ways by which you can have a more proactive role. And I think being proactive it comes down really to getting rid of the invisible and unconscious barriers that prevent us from recognizing talent when it comes in different sizes and shapes. So being proactive, it's also a very important element of the inclusive leadership abilities. There is a lot that anyone, any leader, any manager can do without needing resources and without needing permission from anyone. So I think, realizing that you can be a positive change agent wherever you are, that's something important for an inclusive leader. And the whole point of this Inclusive Leadership Global Conference is to empower you, is to give you, the tactics, the tools to be able to lead your teams in your organization in a more inclusive way. So you can make that happen. And the second thought I'd like to leave you with is the fact that, given the power of unconscious bias and the power of our inability to put ourselves in other people's shoes, at least naturally, if you are not intentionally including people, you might be unintentionally excluding people. So inclusive leadership requires you to be very mindful of what you do and your impact that you have on others. Thank you so much for joining us at this session. Enjoy the rest of the Inclusive Leadership Global Conference. I hope to see you in the next inspiring session. Until then, embrace differences and make a difference. Bye!